Please welcome to the stage Amelia Sciarenza, Director for Program Integration, Boeing.
Hello, everyone.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Hello, it is lunchtime. So the servers are doing a great job getting the plates out to the tables. What a terrific day so far. This has been fantastic and very inspirational. Again, I'm Amelia Sciarenza from Boeing, and we're very pleased to be supporting INSA and supporting events like this. We're passionate about development, and I think from our last panel talking about creating space, Tish talking about creating space, and Karen talking about energy, I think there's a lot of energy and dynamics that have been generated in this room. So I'm very happy to introduce to you today our Luncheon panel, and I'll start with Jonna Mendez, who's with us today. Thank you for being here. Yep. She is the founding board member of the International Spy Museum and the former chief of disguise in the CIA's Office of Technical Service. She is also a specialist in clandestine photography, and in her 27-year career, she earned the CIA's Intelligence Commendation Medal and carried responsibilities in the most hostile theaters of the Cold War. She's currently a fine arts photographer, an author, lecturer, and consultant. In fact, you were a consultant to the CBS television series, The Agency. And with her husband, Antonio, she published Spy Dust, a true story of espionage and romance. Thanks for being here, Jonna. Next, we have Melissa Mahle. She is a former U.S. intelligence officer and an expert in the Middle East. She received a Presidential Letter of Appreciation for her work on the Middle East peace process and numerous exceptional performance awards for her recruitment of agents and collection of intelligence. She is the author of the book Denial and Deception, An Insider's View of the CIA from Iran-Contra to 9/11. Thanks, Melissa. And next, I'd also like to introduce Rollie Flynn. She's a 30-year veteran of the CIA and held a number of senior executive positions at the agency, including Associate Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Executive Director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, Chief of Station in major posts in Southeast Asia and Latin America, and Director of CIA's Leadership Academy. She is currently Managing Principal at Singa Consulting, a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy and School of Foreign Service Security Studies program. So please join me in welcoming this panel. Rebecca's going to facilitate our discussion here. And please, let's give a round of applause welcome to these ladies.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. My name is Rebecca Diamond. I'm the Vice President of Development and Membership at the International Spy Museum. And I want to thank all of you for spending lunch with us today. I want to thank Chuck and Suzanne at INSA and the Board of Directors for having us here today. And thank our panel because they took this time out of their very busy schedules to be with us. And I'm going to point out that Jonna's schedule is so busy that if you look at the Washington Post online today, she has a great article about disguise in the TV show The Americans, what they did right and what they did wrong. So it's pretty cool. I'm very proud of her. Ladies, you all had very different roles in the CIA. Rollie, you were a chief of station, among other things. Melissa, you're operations case undercover officer. And Jonna, you were the Q. You were OTS, chief of disguise. Right. So my question to all of you, and I'm going to start with Rollie, is that's where you ended your careers in the CIA, but where did you start? What was your college education or your background, and then what role did the CIA give you when you began your career? Rollie?
My background was that I'm from California, and I'm the only person, I think, in history who, as an act of rebellion, went to Wellesley College rather than Berkeley. But I'd never been east of Reno, so I always had travel lust. So I graduated from Wellesley with a degree in English. And I applied to anything in print in New York City, and my first job was at Doubleday. And when I applied for the job, they gave me a typing test. And I fortunately passed it, so they hired me. And after I'd been working there, and I moved to Simon & Schuster in book publishing, for about 5 years, I saw an ad in the New York Times. And it said, "Do you like adventure? Would you like to see the world? And would you like to serve your country?" And I thought, well, yeah, that all sounds really great. So I wrote away, and I actually, sorry, I saw that. And so I saw this ad, and I applied. It all sounded great. And those were the days before they had an internet. So I really didn't quite know what I was getting into. And they asked me to read Alan Dulles' book, The Craft of Intelligence. And because I was in book publishing, I could find that book. And years later, I was reading my file. And in my file was the report of my first interviewer. And he said, in the interview write-up, he said, she was the only person in 2 days who had found Alan Dulles' book and read it and could further discuss it. And he said, I think this bodes well for her in the operational service. So I came in as a career trainee, what they now call clandestine service trainee. We were CTs. And so I actually joined the CIA in a professional capacity, a professional apprentice training capacity, similar to the kind of program they have today. But again, I didn't, because we didn't have an internet. I really didn't know what I was getting into. There weren't as many books in those days. So I sort of said, I'll give this 5 years. We'll see what this is. And then I ended up staying for 30. So.
Melissa?
So I'm also from California, and I went to Berkeley. Maybe the only Berkeleyite that could pass the polygraph from that generation. And I had no intention, actually I had no thought of the secret world. I had never even read spy books as a kid. So I'm what I call the accidental spy. I was committed, passionate, totally ready to devote my life to archaeology. And the King Tut exhibit had come through California way back when and inspired me to, why don't I know anything about this culture, this country? And so I became an expert as an Egyptologist. And I promptly, after I graduated, I went into a graduate program, a PhD program, and I went to work in the Middle East as an archaeologist. You know, after spending weeks in a trench that's about 10 feet deep in the heat of summer, and it's dirty, and I was in a country that there happened to be a war to the north. In the mornings, the gunships would take off, and I realized I was far more interested in what was going on in the modern context than 3000 BC. So I came back to the United States and dumped my PhD program, transitioned into a master's program at Columbia University that's focused on the Middle East, but the modern period. And while I was in that whole process, though, of transitioning, what am I going to do next, before I got to Columbia, I got a tap on my shoulder. This is how it used to work in those days. And a professor said, I have somebody I want you to talk to. Because there's no internet, right? There's no way to self-select. So they found me. But here's the crazy thing is, they didn't tell me it was the CIA. Did you know it was the CIA?
I did.
See, I didn't know. But it was the same kind of a pitch of, work for your country, live a life overseas, a big excitement and adventure. I mean, who wouldn't sign up for that? So I went through this whole process of interviewing, and very strange kinds of interviews on top of that, with questions and then the polygraph and all of that. And then they broke cover with me. And they're saying, we're the CIA, we want to hire you as a case officer. I'm saying, what's a case officer? But they had so well profiled me at that point in time that I was actually very well suited to move into a career, and I was hired as a professional also, as a clandestine officer. We called them back then case officers. And so well suited that I was able to flow very comfortably into a career that I had never dreamed about beforehand.
Jonna?
Wow, those are two hard to follow stories. And mine is quite different. I'm from Kansas, not from California. When I was a junior in college, my best friend was getting married in Germany, marrying a US military man. So I went over to be in her wedding. I never went home, except every 5 years at Christmas. I ended up working for Chase Manhattan Bank in Europe. I got married in Europe. I went on a couple of assignments with my first husband, where I did pickup jobs as a secretary, and came back to Washington, D.C. He went to finish up at GW University. I took another secretarial job at CIA and worked as a secretary while he finished school. I basically put him through school. And then he was off. He was a reports officer, and there I was, a secretary, all on my own. So I had progressed up to the top rung of that secretarial ladder. There was nowhere to go. And I told my boss at the time I was going to leave the CIA. I could see the Smithsonian Castle building out my window. We were down across from State Department. And I said, I think there's a career waiting for me at the Smithsonian. And he said, well, you know, I know you're interested in photography. Why don't you take some of our photo courses? Now, the office I was secretary in was the Q of CIA. It was the technical wherewithal to do any clandestine thing you could think of. If you wanted to put in a bug, if you needed new papers, if you needed disguise, if you needed audio, whatever you needed, you would come and see us. If you needed photography, you would come and see us. So he said, take a couple of our courses. So the next week, I'm at one of our airstrips south of DC. There's a little plane, the engine's running. They've taken the doors off the back of the plane. There's a harness inside for me. It was still film cameras. It had my camera had a 1,000mm lens. It's about that long. The course was called Airborne Platforms. I had a microphone. I could say, let's go down there. Let's look at those license plates. Let's look at that microwave tower. And then that night, we had dark rooms, still film. They put on big band music, and I'm developing film, and I said, this is the first day of my real career at CIA, and that's how I began. I came through that secretarial thing. So many women that came on board at that time. It didn't matter where you came from or what you brought or what degree, you would be a secretary until you could figure out how not to be a secretary. That was the test. So I passed that test. It was a good beginning.
Very well. I want to ask you this question. I hope it's not a little too corny, but we'll just go for it anyways. Hollywood has convinced us that women in the intelligence community belong to the sorority of badass bitches who stab by day and then seduce by night. So, which one are you? You know, you can choose from like M, you know, Judi Dench from the Bond movies, Hetty, one of my favorites, Linda Hunt from NCS LA, I think she's like a chief of station, Nikita Taylor, Susan Cooper, Melissa McCarthy, Agent 99 from Get Smart, or anyone else you think you might align with. Rollie?
Oh dear. Well, this is really hard because I don't watch that many of those shows. You know, for years I didn't read spy novels or watch those shows because it seemed too much like work, except it's really not. If I had to pick, and of the ones I've watched, I wouldn't pick a woman. The guy I like the best is Saul on Homeland, Mandy Patinkin, because he just seems to have, and I've only watched through season 4, so maybe he turned out to be a jerk in the end, but he's still a good guy. Okay, good. I like Saul. Saul sort of is smart, got a good operational head on him, and so that's who I'd say.
Melissa?
So this was really, we talked about this ahead of time, and I was saying I have nobody. I don't watch TV, I don't do any of this stuff, and so it was going to kill the question. And I thought, I'm not a party pooper, and I thought I could definitely come up with it. So one of the things I'm very good as being a case officer is I'm good on my feet, I'm fast responding, and you mentioned Melissa McCarthy, so now I can say something because I actually saw that movie. But I'll tell you why. I think that we have so many stereotypes of what an intelligence officer looks like. What's a spy look like? And who's able to do the work? And the reason why I actually like her character is it reminded me so many times of being sitting in a room on the back bench, and somebody says something, and I'm looking around, and I say, I can do that, and then they get right passed on by. So I empathize with their character, but she wins in the end, and I think, yeah, like me. Okay.
And Jonna?
Well, of course I would want to be Q. It's time for a woman to be Q. We're going to have a woman leader of CIA, perhaps, coming up any minute. A woman could very easily lead my office. It was not always so. It was a man's world. It was a man's office full of chemists and physicists and engineers and all kinds of technical specialties. But slowly over the years, women have infiltrated, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a female Q at CIA. I would mention, when you talked about Judi Dench, that character in the Bond movies, who I think a lot of us found kind of compelling because she had this look and she had this manner. She was actually modeled after one of our board members, one of our original board members at SPY, and that's Dame Stella Remington of MI6. Everything about Judi Dench as M was modeled after Stella Remington, including that blonde hair and the haircut. Yeah. So if Stella was here, she could entertain us all, but I'm speaking for her.
Well, thank you for indulging me. Let's do a little deep dive. I'm going to get back to Gina in a little bit, but I do have a question. How do you think, ladies, you made a difference or made a change that allowed things to be different for the new IC while you were in your jobs? Melissa?
So, it was truly a different world. I spent my career in the Central Intelligence Agency, and when I joined, I was hired specifically because of my background. I had lived and worked in the Middle East. I was a fluent Arabic speaker. People like me just didn't grow on trees back then and even today. So I was hired to be a case officer, and I had the gumption to presume I was hired to be a case officer in the Middle East. And I went through training. We have a very intensive training regime that we go through, and I excelled, and I get at the other end, and I have to sit down with my boss, for your first real interview with up your chain of command, and my boss, of course a male, said to me, well, Melissa, where would you like to serve? And this is, the process at the CIA where you're going to find where your home base is going to be, and back then it was normally, if you're a case officer, it's going to be in a geographical division. And I said, well, sir, I'd like to serve in the Middle East. And he looked at me, and he said, we don't send women to the Middle East. And I was just kind of astounded, because then why did they hire me? I didn't speak Spanish. And so I was, my husband has an adjective for this. He says stubborn. I just persevere. And so I didn't back down. I said, well, sir, that's really the only place that I feel like I can make a big difference. And so, well, why don't you think about this a little bit and come back and we'll have another interview in a week. And so I came back in another week, and he said, well, Melissa, where would you like to serve? And I said, well, sir, I'd like to serve in the Middle East. We did a couple go-arounds there, and I think finally they just got tired of me. And they said, Melissa, we're going to send her to the Middle East. She'll be there for 6 months. She'll hate it. She won't be able to deal with the Arab male, and she'll be back begging for Paris. I spent my entire career in the Middle East. So I think one of the things that, a door that I shoved open was that women need to be given the opportunity to succeed. And when I came on in, that wasn't really a consideration on my chain of management. And so it was something that I was constantly having to push for in ways that were acceptable at that time and place, to shove those doors open. And so that women who came after me, they didn't have to deal with that kind of question. Or the other question, which was quite humiliating, was in that same interview was, what are your plans for childbearing? Okay? And so you know what I did? I lied. They hired me to lie, cheat, and steal for the government, so why don't I start now?
Oh, you're done.
Embarrassed you.
No. Well, I was going to actually, before I ask the other two the same question, I was going to go a little bit further with you and say, okay, now you've got the job you wanted. You're in the Middle East. They're concerned about you working with men in the Middle East. So how did that turn out? What did you have to go through? What kind of gender biases did you deal with? And you were an irregular combatant in the IC workforce. How did you make that work?
So I think one of the things that, and this is not even a gender-specific comment, to do our kind of work in which you recruit foreigners to spy for the United States, is in that whole relationship is you have to be able to get control over it. And so you have to be able to direct these relationships, whether you're male or female. And being a female and you're recruiting men, because that's what, usually those are the people that have access to the intelligence you're looking for, you had to be able to find a way that you could do that and without playing the Matahari role. Because listen, if you can't sleep with them all, right? So, and you think I jest. No, I remember when I was at one of the first of all, I never had a female mentor, but during the orientation week where the death by wiring diagram, one lady came up and she was really a battle axe, and she said, there was one woman in the room and it was me, and she looked right at me and she says, you have to remember, you can't sleep with them all. And it was so inappropriate, and I was so like, is that really just a comment for me? What about the guys in the room? So getting control in these relationships, you have to, male or female, you have to be able to understand your operational environment, understand what motivates people, understand how to manipulate them. And I tell you, I had the skill set to do all those things. I never had a problem recruiting an Arab man. I was only once in a situation where I felt myself at risk over gender issues, and that's when I was being chased around a conference table by a Frenchman. Does that answer your question?
That's a great answer. All of them, actually. So, Rollie, how do you think you made a difference or a change that allowed things to be different today in the new IC?
That's a really hard question to answer, I think, because I wonder if I did do that much. I mean, when I came in, there weren't very many women who were going to be operations officers. I was undercover case officer. And most of the women, candidly, who came in with me dropped out and decided to do something else. So there weren't that many of us. And so the way I approached it was really to try to erase from anyone's perception that I was a woman. I mean, just to do the job every bit as well as any man could do. And I remember an incident in my first tour, and I was out in the Horn of Africa, and I was supposed to go to a meeting in a safe house, and to get there I was doing a surveillance detection route to try to make sure that I was clean and there was no surveillance on me. And I will say in the Horn of Africa, I don't exactly blend in, but we have our tradecraft, and shortly into my route to go to this meeting, there were two young men riding a motorbike who decided to follow me, and they and I don't think that they were from the security service, because they kept saying, hey, want to go to a movie? Want to go with me? And I could not lose them. I mean, I, walked for, we take a long time before we go to a meeting to clean ourselves off. And I took a long time. I could not lose them. And so I said, well, I can't go to this meeting and drag these people with me, these two young guys. And I don't think there's anything sinister in here, but I can't bring them with me. So anyway, have them follow along and see where I'm going. And so I didn't go to the meeting, which in the clandestine business causes all sorts of, because you've got to try to figure out a way to meet them another time and the person another, the source. And I'll never forget, the next morning I went in, first thing in the morning, went in to see the chief of station. He said, how'd your meeting go? And I said, Chief, I got to tell you something. So I told him the story. And he was kind of like, well, when's your next? You're back up. And I went through that. As I was leaving his office, I heard him say, woman case officers. And so I really tried everything I could do to try to make me every bit as valuable, if not more valuable, than any male. Which meant, I didn't take much leave. I worked longer and harder than most people. When I had my children, I was out in the field in Southeast Asia when I had my firstborn, and I was back at work within a week of giving birth because I felt I had to do that. And one of the interesting things that got reported to me was when I went to go give birth, one of the female case officers who was actually in a management position, not very high, but she was one of the branch chiefs in the station where I was working, apparently in the weekly staff meeting said, well, we ought to have a backup plan because Rollie's probably not going to come back. Who's going to take over her cases? And when I heard that, I was just, even more convinced that I was going to, prove her wrong and everyone else that I was going to hold up my end. Because in the field, it's a burden to somebody else if you can't handle your caseload. And the other thing I told myself was I was not going to be the way she had been to anyone else. But I think, too, it was a choice. And it was a choice to say, I'm not going to take time off to, particularly in the field, to spend with my newborn baby. Fortunately, I was in a place where there was a lot of great help, affordable, great help to get me through that. With my second child, I was actually at headquarters in Washington, so I did take a couple months off. I felt I could do that. And I think things had changed enough at that point. Plus, I was more senior. So people knew I had had 3 successful tours in the field at that point. And so people weren't messing with me. But, again, it was 2 things. One, proving to everybody that I could do the job as well as anyone. And second of all, making a commitment that I would help other women at the same time and not make the kind of mistakes or, write them off from the get-go.
Well, I have a follow-up to that before I move on to Jonna, but you've sort of already answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you believe you were challenged by being a good officer versus being a good woman officer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. In fact, I've written about this before, but I did have a boss once who told me, and this was at a point when I was quite senior in my career. He said to me, Rollie, you have to understand, to succeed in the DO, the Directorate of Operations, you have to be able to convince the people around you that if you had to, you could call in a B-52 strike. And he said, now, I'm not telling you not to be ladylike. You have to be ladylike too. But you've got to be strong. And you've got to be able to convince people that you can do the hard stuff. And so I think in that, there was this implicit message not to be a you-know-what, a bitch, excuse me. Because that's what tough women get painted as. And he was telling me in a nice way. You got to be tough, but you can't be a bitch. And
It's hard.
it's hard.
Even today.
It's hard.
Right? So, Jonna, how do you think you made a difference or a change that allowed things to be different today in the new IC?
Well, there's a lot of commonality in what the three of us say, although generationally there's a difference here. Experience-wise, I worked in a different piece of the CIA, but there are some very familiar stories here. The office that I worked in was an office of men. There were very, very few women in that office, and I was fine with that. I came in as a photographer, as a clandestine photography, using tiny, tiny cameras that you can see today in the International Spy Museum. They've always been secret, but they're secret no longer. Think of a camera that you could put in a lipstick. The lipstick would still work, but it's a camera. Think of a camera you could put in a pen, a key fob. You could put these cameras in anything. They were that big. Inside of them was a cassette, a film cassette, that big. That was my specialty, those little tiny cameras. And when I started working in our technical offices, I was working with a group of men, all of them graduates of RIT, all of them with advanced degrees in film technology. They knew more about film and emulsions and cameras than I ever would know. My goal was to be the person that someone would come in and hand the film to me. And that's actually what happened. I was so careful and so good at what I did that they would bypass the guys with the degrees who are kidding around in the back, and they bring me the film because they knew that I would never, ever lose a piece of their film. By lose, I mean lose it in the developers, somehow chemically lose the image. Never did. I found at CIA, in the technical end of it, if you proved that you could do it, they would let you do it. They didn't really care about your degree. And throughout my career, we kept moving that forward. The men in my office, once I proved myself in our dark rooms, in our photo laboratories, I went out and did trainings. I met with you guys. I met with your agents in safe houses, and I trained the agents how to use my tiny cameras. The men in my office always said, "Oh, too bad you can't go to the Middle East." I said, "Why not?" They said, "Oh, they'll never listen to you in the Middle East." Those men, women are visible. They don't care. They won't listen to you. I said, "Are you telling me if I'm telling one of those men how to be more secure, how to protect himself and his family, how to keep from getting arrested, how to communicate with us without being arrested, are you telling me that he's not going to listen to me because I'm a woman?" I said, "You are so wrong."
Right.
And they were wrong. The flip side of it was, when you're training a Middle Eastern man, as a woman, if they don't get it, they have no problem telling you they didn't get it. "Would you say that again? Show me again. Let's do that again." But if it was a man, if it was a Western man training them, they would pretend that they understood, and you'd leave and the whole thing would fall apart. So it was not only not a disadvantage to being a woman, this is what I found, it was an advantage to being a woman in that particular part of the world. I went out to what we call the subcontinent and fell in love with it and decided I wanted to go there. I wanted an assignment there. For me, it was 2 years out, and the job that would be available was a job I didn't know how to do. So I said, "So train me." And I went into 2 years of intensive training. That's how I ended up in disguise. Went out to the subcontinent, had a fabulous tour, went back home, ended up chief of disguise. One of the best jobs I ever had. It was so much fun. Did I make a difference? How did I make a difference? I paved the way for a lot of women. I had a lot of women watch what I did and then follow me and emulate the hands-on. If you can do it, they'll let you do it. A lot of those women rose up to positions of some significance in my office. I think all of us did that.
Did you ever work for a woman?
Yes, I worked for a woman. And to tell you the truth, I preferred to work for men.
I only worked for a woman at headquarters, I think twice.
I never worked for a woman.
Never in the field.
The woman I worked for wasn't particularly, she was a very good officer, she wasn't a very good boss. And so there wasn't much to take away from that relationship, I thought. But women have prospered. And at CIA, women have always, on the 7th floor, in the senior administrative positions at CIA, women have flourished. Where it was always tough for women is where these two were in the field, doing what I think is the hardest job in the CIA. And that is spotting someone, assessing them, going in, developing them, and then figuring out how to get them to basically betray their country. And you have to think to yourself, what would it take for someone to come to you and say, you know, I want what you've got. Would you violate your secrecy agreements? Would you do that for me? That has to be the hardest job. I could not do that job. So I have nothing but spectacular admiration for these two.
So, on that note, what was the toughest time, Rollie, or the toughest story that you can share that had to do with turning somebody? Like, what was the most challenging time?
Oh, they're all challenging. Actually, that's not true. Some people sort of volunteer. But to try to, I think you're asking me to recruit someone. My hardest recruitment story. I have a couple of them. And they both involved the same thing, where I thought I had done the assessment correctly, that I had understood, you know, their motivations, had teed up a recruitment pitch to the point where they would say yes. And in one case, the person said no. And I had brought it to a point where there was no blowback. She wasn't going to, this was a she. She was not going to report me because we had enough of a trusting relationship. The other person said yes. He said, yes, okay. I can do that. That's great. That's wonderful. So I, you know, went back into work the next day, and we wrote this great cable to headquarters. He gave me some intelligence that I could report. I had a recruitment, and when you're case officer, operations officer, it's really important to get recruitments. You don't get promoted if you don't get recruitments. It's very important to write intelligence, but the real differentiator for a case officer is recruiting. So great, I had this recruitment. It was really important that I get it. I had it. And this was on my first tour. I went back to the next meeting with this gentleman I had recruited, and he changed his mind. And I was like, oh no. So I'm pulling out all the same tricks, and he's pretty adamant. He thought about it. He just didn't think he could do that. So I'll never forget, I had to go into the office, and this was the same chief of station who had muttered, female case officers. So I went in, and he coached me through it, and he said, okay, here's how we're going to get beyond this. We're not going to, you know, we don't need to tell headquarters this quite yet. So coached me through how I was going to reapproach this. And it was good coaching, because I did persuade this guy that we could do this on his terms and he would stay recruited. And so that was one of the very hardest. I did have one where I had to play a foreign national, because this was of a guy who had access to a terrorist organization in Southeast Asia. And he never would have worked for the US government or for the CIA. So I had to play a different nationality. And so that wasn't actually very hard. He was venal. He wanted money. He would have done it. He wouldn't have done it for an American, but he did it for this particular nationality that I was posing as. So that was a little tricky, just because I had to make sure I could pass for that other nationality. And fortunately, it was a part of the world I knew pretty well. So that was tricky. But that one really was easy, just because he really didn't care. He just wanted the money. So anyway, and he provided some decent intelligence.
Melissa, explore for us a professional moment that became like a turning point in your career, an aha moment.
We didn't rehearse these questions ahead of time, so then you have to have that moment of, okay, what's unclassified? You know, I want to build on something that you said, because every single recruitment is hard. And every single recruitment is different. And to be able to navigate that, in order to put a person on a journey, and through the personal relationship, get them to decide it's a good idea to commit treason, I mean, that is really a lot of work. And not just anybody will do it. And you have to be able to assess people as you're going through that whole process, because what you don't want to do is to invest 2 years of your time and get nowhere, and you walk out of that tour with no chop, and then you're going to have your hallway reputation is going to be, yeah, but she can't recruit.
Yeah, and that's what they said about women. Women can't recruit.
Right.
That was the dig on women.
So it was so important to go and to get your feet wet. And so it doesn't really, my best recruit wasn't my first recruit, but my first recruit was the most important recruit. And it wasn't that this guy had great access, but he had some access. But it was that I took him through the process in a reasonable period of time, and I proved to my boss, but more importantly, I proved to myself I could do this job and I can love every minute of the process. So that was my aha.
Can I just add one thing? For some of the people we dealt with, we talked about persuading them to commit treason, which is what they were doing. But in some cases, their nationality, they worked for governments that were so horrible. You know, they're dictatorships, violators of human rights, or they were part of a narco-trafficking network or a terrorist group. So really, they had ideological reasons for doing what they were doing. They hated the system they were working under, and really out of sort of an allegiance to the United States, that they thought that was the right thing to do. So it wasn't just, you know, yeah, it was treason, but they had mixed, you know, again, and then you'd have to figure out what is that specific person's motivation? What button do I need to push to get them to yes?
All great answers. I'm going to turn to women bosses and the fact that there may be a new one soon at the CIA. I would love to hear your thoughts on Gina Haspel, since I'm assuming all of you worked with her or saw her or knew her in some capacity. So I'm going to start with you, Jonna. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I'm the dud up here on the stage because I do not know her. I have not worked with her. Again, it's a generational thing. But I've heard enough about her from just a broad spectrum of people that I watched this process, and I'm still watching this process very, very closely. It's about time that there was a woman lead that organization. The consensus seems to be that there is not a better qualified candidate, male or female. This is a woman from inside the organization. It's been a while since we had one of those. It's been since Colby, Bill Colby. She knows the business inside and out. I think a lot of people are really cheering her on. There's a lot of stuff on cable TV. There's a lot of stuff on the evening news that you know, it's always context, and the context in a situation like this is not always clear because so much of it is classified, so much of it is closed. But I think she's going to be confirmed, and I'll be one of the first ones to cheer her on.
Fantastic. Melissa.
So I watched her confirmation hearing, and I was struck by a couple of things. First of all, I was very pleased that this wasn't all about a woman being confirmed to be the director of Central Intelligence, because that's not what it was about. So, you know, if this had happened in my generation, that's what it would have been all about, and rather than talking about suitability for the position. So I was pleased to see that, to hear that. But I also was struck, and it reminds me of something that you had said. She said, you know, she said, I'm surprised by my own success. She said, what I did is that I worked hard and I worked quietly. And that made me think very much about what's wrong with kind of, even now, today, how we perceive the power game. And because, yes, we should do our work and we should do our work well, but that doesn't mean we need to be on the back bench and self-select to the back bench. And she's been successful because she's very competent, you know, and she has been able to navigate this very, you know, let's be honest, CIA operations, those winds, the political winds are very dangerous and anything can take you down. She has been able to navigate through that and succeed and have really the organization stand behind her, which is a tremendous success. But she felt compelled to say that she worked quietly and kept her head down. And I hope that the next female director of the Central Intelligence Agency or any other stands up in the center of the room and says, I'm here because I worked hard, I believe in my mission, and I can do this job. And that's what I would like to see. And that's not a criticism of her, it's more of a reflection of, you know, of the time and the age of how she had to, you know, to survive and to thrive in that environment.
I think a lot has been said that I agree with. I don't have much more to add. I know Gina. I've worked with Gina. I'm a huge supporter of Gina. Say that up front. But I've been in several forums recently where there were a lot of CIA officers present. And when her name was mentioned, there was spontaneous applause and clapping. And one, people got up on their feet and cheered. Supremely competent. I mean, she's an incredibly competent person. I imagine some of you may know her in the room. Also a very warm, very nice person. Regarding the program that everybody keeps talking about, I'm not going to stand up here and defend the program, but the fact is that lawyers at the Justice Department approved that program, determined it wasn't torture. That program was briefed to the White House. The White House directed it. It was an INSA program. Congress was briefed. Our oversight committees were briefed on that program. And I think it's unfair to judge her, she who was not an architect or a designer of the program, but a mid-level officer at the time, to judge her ex post facto for what later became an unlawful program. It was terminated. The lawyers in a different Justice Department said, no, it's not legal. But it was legal at the time she was involved in it. So I think it's unfair. But I think she'll make a great director, long overdue. The fact that she's a woman would be irrelevant were it not for the fact that we've never had a female director, and I'm personally thrilled to see her there.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to now open up to the floor and see if anyone has any questions for our panel. I see a lady back there.
Wonderful presentation. You really are all cool women. Very cool. Wow. How did you see women's perception in the CIA shift throughout your career? Question could go to either one of you.
Jonna, you want to answer that one?
Women's progression, how did it shift?
Perception.
I think there isn't a place in the agency that women aren't is that me?
Maybe you're bugged.
They didn't like the question. No, it's easy.
Women are everywhere. Women are all over the place. Women's roles have changed so much in our careers. I think we kind of hand it off to you guys at this point because you got to take it from here and keep it going. It took some energy to get it up to where it is. There isn't an area of CIA that doesn't have women at every level, from our Office of Security, certainly the Directorate of Operations, or whatever they call it today, the analytical part of the CIA, as women at every level have had women running it. The DNI's office, the whole intelligence community is swarming with competent, professional women. And I think it's going to be fun to watch.
Hi, my name is Katie, and I'm an intern here at INSA. And I was just wondering, within the DO, there obviously isn't a lot of, or any external recognition that you can receive. So I was wondering kind of how you did with that, and did you receive any sort of internal recognition for the hard work that you were doing?
I think they all did. Rollie, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you sign up for that career if you want accolades publicly. But yes, there was recognition internally. There were awards, there were promotions, there were assignments, and that is its own recognition. I want to get it just a little bit something on that perception too. I absolutely agree with Jonna that there are women in all parts of the CIA now. I will say that I retired at the end of 2011, and toward the end of my career, I was involved in trying to fill assignments, and women were not applying to be chiefs of station. And I don't know whether that's their own perceptions of themselves, not signing up for those kinds of jobs. And women were continuing to opt out of the operational, the case officer track. I don't know if that's still happening today, but and I don't know what that's about. But and maybe it is, again, it's work-life balance and dual careers, because
Rollie, I wonder if dual careers might not be part of that.
Dual
because,
careers may be part of it.
In my tenure, I served on a committee at CIA that was about married working couples, where the husband worked at CIA, it was always the husband, and the wife had some great job at some big bank, and these couples would not go overseas. It was an issue. I wonder if that just grew.
Well, and I believe it's probably still true that in the Directorate of Operations, there just aren't as many women at the top in terms of field operations. And being a chief of station is the coin of the realm in the Directorate of Operations. You can rise without it, but it's pretty important. And so, and yeah, it's dual careers perhaps is part of why there aren't more female chiefs of station. Women can do it, and they can do it really well.
Did anybody else have any extra comments on the recognition question?
Recognition. I think probably the most important recognition when you're an operations officer is that of your peers.
Any other questions? There has to be a lot of questions. Okay, right here.
Thank you. Women in our career field are faced with many challenges. We've explored some of them already today. I was wanting to ask, from your own perspectives, what challenges did you see earlier in your careers that over time diminished?
I saw in terms of the perception of female case officers, it changed. When I first started, the rap was women can't recruit. They'll be really good at handling the agents and writing up the intelligence, but they can't recruit. And I remember on my first tour, this same crusty chief of station, who I came to really like, by the way. I remember I came back from an agent meeting and I wrote up, I don't know, 8 intelligence reports. I was really good at gathering intelligence and writing it up. And he, only half teasing, he was thrilled that I wrote up all that intelligence, but kind of half teasing, he took me aside and he said, you know, you got to watch out because they're going to want to make you a reports officer if you write too much intelligence. They won't want you, you know, they'll see you in a reports officer. Perfectly legitimate, very important career track. It tends to be a majority female, I think, still. And it's a professional career track, but in those days, that's where they put women. And he said, watch it. That could happen to you.
Melissa, any comments?
I think perceptions maybe on the life balance issues have changed tremendously, because I think now it's not a perfect world now, But when you tell your boss that you're pregnant and planning to be, out of the office for a little while, that's not a game changer for your career by default. And it certainly was in my time in the agency, to the extent, you can't make this stuff up. I knew I had this fabulous job, and I got pregnant, and I was overseas. And I knew what was going to happen when I told my boss that I was ahead of a base, and I knew that job would be taken away from me, and I would never get it back. And because it was a great job. And so you know what I did? I didn't tell him I was pregnant until I was 7 months along.
There you go.
All right? Too late to pull me out of country.
They trained her too well. They trained you too well.
I don't have to do that today.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Speaking of that pregnancy and that child, is that the one that's graduating? Okay.
Yes. Time
so
flies.
she has this picture of somebody who was babysitting or holding the child for a little while back when she was a baby, right? Who's that guy again?
So every parent understands that problem that you have when, for whatever reason, your child care falls through, right? And you end up taking your kid to work. When you're an operations officer, sometimes that can be a little more interesting. And I remember, I was overseas. I had a nanny. Life was, easy in that sense, but I was away from my family a lot. So I had a very dependable nanny, but you do have to give your nanny a day off. And my husband was not there, and Yasser Arafat's office called. And Yasser Arafat he's the late chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the head of the Palestinian Authority. It's one of the few countries I can actually talk about that where I was. And it's not a country, entity, whatever. So what do? It was urgent. It was related to a terrorist threat. I had to go. So I took my baby. And Arafat, he was a bit of an old goat, but he loved kids. So here he is we're having a very serious conversation about threat information. He's bouncing my baby on his lap. So that's another wonderful thing about the Arab culture is their views on family. They're very welcoming and stuff. And it was the only time that I ended up taking my child to an operational context because the needs of the service.
Great cover.
I love that story.
Right.
They all have great stories. Mary.
You guys are so awesome. I'm just like coolest people I've ever met. My question is, how does the United States stack up in their use of female intelligence officers compared to other countries? Are we ahead of the other countries? Are we behind? Or in what ways is it different?
I know in Moscow, we had enormous success for a period of time using women operatives because the KGB didn't use their women, and they assumed that we would not use ours. And so our women were like, they couldn't believe that they would be doing operational acts. And they had some great success out there. That's the one place that I can kind of pinpoint and say we were different. And it worked to our advantage, enormously to our advantage. Around the rest of the world, I don't know.
Middle East women don't work, have not traditionally worked for governments and intelligence.
It's hard to do it.
Any women in the Mossad?
It's country by country. There are some countries that use women and use them very effectively.
The Israelis, for example.
And others that do not.
Okay. Well, I think I'm getting ready to get the sign that says you're done. Wrap it up. So thank you, everybody. I love the questions. Our panel extraordinaire. I hope you enjoyed them, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer questions. Some of them have books outside. If you want a book signed, they're happy to do that for you. But thank you again to everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Rebecca, we want to thank you for the partnership We hope we continue this. What a treat to have you all here today.